Is our tariff strategy being orchestrated by Dr. Strangelove or by Shakespearean brilliance? You're about to find out. Hello, I'm Todd Sheets, and this is the On Wealth and Progress podcast. On April 2nd, President Trump announced what he called the Liberation Day tariffs. Obviously caught off guard by both the level of the new rates and the lack of a phase-in period, the stock market dropped sharply. Critics on both the left and the right harnessed the market drop to slam the administration. In an interview on the All In podcast, former Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, Larry Summers, claimed that the combination of simultaneously falling stock and bond prices was evidence that the world was beginning to value the U.S. like a third world dictatorship. The Wall Street Journal made references to the Smoot-Hawley tariffs enacted during the Great Depression. My posts on the tariff proposal noted there was no reason to believe we were heading into a financial collapse, and that the market reaction was more akin to what initially happened with COVID, i.e., investors were simply experiencing an understandable increase in uncertainty about the near-term earnings expectations that drive stock values. The speed of the subsequent rebound is consistent with this perspective. While a bit jarring, one benefit of Trump's approach is its warp speed-like effect on negotiations. Just this past week, agreements in principle were announced with both the United Kingdom and China. After the resulting rebound, markets were actually up a bit from just before the Liberation Day announcements. In light of these developments, the critics' use of the temporary downturn to bash the administration is a bit reminiscent of the old line about a drunk using a lamppost more for support than for illumination. In this vein, it would be a mistake to read too much into the market's rebound. Nevertheless, these events help shine a light not just on trade policy, but also on the animosity that drives so much commentary about our 47th president. Dr. Strangelove or Shakespearean brilliance. A bit like Ronald Reagan, Trump inspires hatred from the far left because he stands in unabashed opposition to so much of what they believe in. Reagan dealt with this through a rare combination of wit, humility, and diplomacy that even his opponents found hard to resist. Trump, on the other hand, tends to be confrontational, boastful, and often it pushes issues to or even past the limits of what even those who agree with his objectives consider appropriate. With respect to tariffs, he has also directly confronted long-held beliefs about free trade, how China's trade policies or Europe's auto tariffs could be considered free escapes me. Nevertheless, these policies were adopted by the Clinton-Obama left and are considered by the Wall Street Journal right to be gospel, all of which makes Trump something of a confounding political figure. After all, how can someone inflame such visceral hatred in his opponents while also dividing his own party and still end up winning 2 elections against seemingly insurmountable odds? One important factor behind Trump's improbable success relates to frustrations with a long string of policy failures that can be grouped into one of 3 categories: upward mobility, peace and stability, and our founding ideals. Let's start with upward mobility. The free trade globalization narrative told Americans that opening up our markets to China would raise living standards for everyone. Instead, working class Americans fell further and further behind. In addition, the asset bubbles, collapses, and bailouts that resulted in large part from the Fed, i.e. the Committee for Centrally Planned Interest Rates, misguided attempts to steer the economy through globalization have cost investors and homeowners billions and led to the over-financialization of our economy. Poorly conceived policy responses to the Great Recession, COVID, and climate issues have only resulted in an anemic recovery, chronic deficits, dangerous debt levels, and a bout of the worst inflation since the 1970s. Furthermore, overregulation has left Western economies wallowing in either stagnation, like Europe, or anemic growth, like the United States, and therefore incapable of creating widespread upward mobility and hope for a better future. The second category was peace and stability. The globalization narrative that followed the Cold War also foretold a future of spreading democracy, even as Russia and China became ever more aggressive adversaries. The failures and human costs of the Iraq War and related nation-building efforts only heightened these disillusions. In the midst of all of this, disastrous immigration policies have been allowed to run amok. Finally, our founding ideals have been challenged. The DEI agenda became a tool that threatened the widely held belief that our true North Star is to become a colorblind meritocracy. And the cancel culture that accompanied DEI developed into a McCarthy-era-like political weapon for the dismissal and repression of dissenting viewpoints. In short, after celebrating our great victory in the Cold War, we all went to sleep dreaming of a more prosperous tomorrow filled with ever-growing freedoms, only to wake up 3 decades later in the clutches of a developing dystopian nightmare. Instead of the former communist world becoming more like us, we were becoming more like them. Amidst this backdrop, many Americans came to view Trump's iconoclastic and combative nature as exactly what we needed to roll back this tsunami of political failure. To borrow a line from the movie Network, the electorate collectively crawled out of their windows, went to a Trump rally, and screamed, quote, "I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore," end of quote. So, to bring the discussion back to the tariffs, are we dealing with, as many of Trump's detractors believe, a Dr. Strangelove-like figure on the verge of toppling Western civilization, or, as his ardent supporters believe, a brilliant tactician with a method to his Shakespearean madness? The Geneva meetings. The recent audible sigh of relief coming from the business community is largely attributable to a diminishing sense of uncertainty about tariff policy. Specifically, fears that we were heading into an all-out trade war with the 800-pound panda bear in the negotiations, and with no idea of when clear rules of engagement might emerge, have at least been temporarily put to rest. In 2024, effective tariffs on China were roughly 20%. The new framework from Geneva calls for 10% reciprocal tariffs and a continuation of the fentanyl surcharge enacted earlier this year. Importantly, according to the White House press release, the U.S., quote, will retain all duties imposed on China prior to April 2, 2025, end of quote. That is, prior to the Liberation Day announcement. Of course, we'll have to wait until the final tariffs are announced to really know where this ends up, but a few preliminary conclusions are in order. First, it appears that average tariff rates on Chinese goods will increase, probably from around 20% to at least somewhere north of 30%. Second, while this is a meaningful increase, it is also one that American businesses should be able to adjust to, just as they did to the tariffs imposed during Trump's first administration. Third, like the Trump 1.0 tariffs and COVID, the near shutdown that occurred after Liberation Day and these new higher rates send a clear message to American business. It is essential to continue diversifying away from China. Now, various critics have voiced the idea that Trump blanked and China's Xi won the Geneva negotiations. At this point, this view appears unfounded. As I pointed out in A Tale of Two Empires, it is essential that we decouple from what has become an increasingly hostile Chinese Communist Party, or CCP. Before Trump's first term, the effective tariff rate on Chinese goods was around 3.5%. Now it appears headed towards somewhere north of 30%. Suffice it to say, if finalized at around these levels, the new tariff should continue to move us towards a gradual decoupling with the CCP. Some commentators have argued that the turmoil caused by the Liberation Day tariffs suggests that a decoupling with China is unworkable. This makes no sense. As noted earlier, Trump increased tariffs substantially during his first term, and business did just fine. Finally, while the administration is often, and sometimes deservedly, criticized for messaging, the rollout of the new agreements with the UK and China was nothing short of masterful. The UK agreement was more symbolic than substantive. We actually run a good surplus with them. But its announcement on the Thursday before the weekend meetings in Geneva helped create a sense that, after much hand-wringing, negotiations were starting to build momentum. Then, on Friday, Trump made what appeared to be a casual comment that 145% tariffs were too high when he posted on social media, quote, 80% tariff on China seems right, end quote. While apparently informal, it's reasonable to assume that these comments were in fact designed to appease a previous demand by Xi that the U.S. needed to make the first move in lowering rates before substantive conversations could begin. Even as Trump set up the potential for something meaningful to happen in Geneva, Scott Bessent was lowering the bar of public expectations. The Treasury Secretary deftly framed the meetings as simply a first step in de-escalating tensions and in setting up a framework for future discussions. When Bessent then emerged from the tariff talks with the agreement in principle mentioned above, the markets rebounded dramatically. It was all a bit like the reaction to an announcement that an uncharacteristically detained Swiss train would be taking off on time after all. Mr. Bessent deserves the high praise he has received for both his overall role in the tariff negotiations and his adroit administration of the Geneva meetings. But this too often comes across as a backhanded compliment. In other words, a way for critics to grudgingly admit something good has happened while continuing to knock the president. I'm not against criticism when it's due. The meme coins and the jet come to mind. But in this case, we should ask the double-fisted backhanders a few questions. Who elevated the imbalances with China into actionable results in the first place? Who nominated Mr. Bessent to the position of Treasury Secretary and then appointed him to play a leading role on trade? And finally, who held firm as Secretary Xi upped the ante in the initial back and forth and then took the risk of public criticism by signaling a willingness to come down from the 145% rates that preceded Geneva? Clearly, there is much method here. Summary. Who knew that something as seemingly mundane as trade and tariffs could result in an unfolding drama led by characters and events of nearly Shakespearean proportions? While there is still a long way to go, Trump and Bessent both deserve a great deal of credit for orchestrating what has the potential to continue the decoupling with China that began in Trump's first term. My hope is that the tariff negotiations will lead to something of a two-tiered playing field. On one tier, trade policy will be used to isolate consistently hostile and threatening regimes like China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. On another tier, we will level the remaining imbalances with our allies and then establish a more free trade zone that promotes upward mobility, enhanced security through rising economic resources, and an incentive for the hostile regimes to end their aggressions and join the prosperity. Only time will tell if this is where President Trump is leading us. For now, there is still reason to hope the final production of this drama will be worthy of a standing ovation. Thanks for your interest. This is Todd Sheets, and you've been listening to the On Wealth and Progress podcast. If you found this helpful, please recommend it to at least one other person. Subscriptions to my Substack newsletter are currently free, and you can sign up by going to toddsheets.substack.com or to my webpage, toddsheetswriter.com, where there's a connection. To purchase a copy of my book, 2008 What Really Happened, please go to Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com, Bookshop.org, or EncounterBooks.com. Thanks again, and have a great day.